There are cities that burn and cities that are burned. Dresden was the second kind. I know the difference because I was inside it. The fire that came in February 1945 did not start small and grow. It arrived all at once, a heat so concentrated and so total that the air itself became the fuel. I was 28 years old. I had lived my entire life in that city. I knew the smell of the river in winter, the sound the cobblestones made under a loaded cart on a cold morning, the particular silence of the Altstadt on a Sunday before the first bells. I knew all of that, and then I knew what it looked like when all of that was gone. What nobody tells you, what the history books cannot quite explain, is that the most disorienting thing was not the fire itself. It was the light it made. Dresden burned for 2 days and 2 nights, and for those 2 days the sky above the city was the colour of an open furnace. You could read a newspaper by it from kilometres away. I know because I tried. The last ordinary thing I did before the bombing began was argue with my colleague Heinz about a typesetting error on the evening edition. The paper had to go to press by 6. I remember being annoyed. I remember thinking the correction could not wait. I did not know, standing over that type tray, that I was annoyed for the last time in a city that still existed. By the time the argument was settled, a misplaced M- in a column about a Winter Hilfswerk donation drive Dresden, as I had known it, had perhaps 12 hours left. Nobody warned us. That is the first thing I want to say clearly. Nobody warned us. There had been rumours. There were always rumours by 1945. But Dresden had gone largely untouched for so long, longer than Hamburg, longer than Cologne, that a particular reasoning had taken hold. We had told ourselves a story, and the story was that Dresden was different. We were wrong about that in the most complete way a person can be wrong. Dresden, in 1944, was still, in many ways, the city it had always been. Not untouched by the war, nothing in Germany was untouched by then. The young men were gone. The food had been rationed for 5 years. There were bombed-out refugees from other cities crowding in, sleeping in the spare rooms of distant relatives. And the railway station was permanently full of people moving east or west or simply waiting for news of somewhere else. But the city itself, the physical city, was still standing. The Frauenkirche still rose at the centre of the Altstadt, the great stone dome the Saxons called the Stone Bell. You could see it from almost anywhere in the old city, which was not a large area. The Zwinger Palace was intact. Which mattered to people, the Zwinger was where the paintings were kept, the Raphael Madonna and the rest of the collection. I passed the Zwinger courtyard on my walk to work every morning. In wintertime the trees were bare and the statues were covered in protective wrapping, each one bound up carefully against the cold and against whatever else was coming, and it had the look of something being packed for a journey that no one had announced yet. I thought the wrapping was ordinary precaution, the kind of thing you do when you are being careful. I did not understand yet that it was the kind of precaution you take when you already know what is coming, and you are preparing for an absence rather than a delay. My route from my flat in the Neustadt across the Elbe on the north bank took me over the Augustusbrücke every morning. The bridge was wide and old, and the river ran dark green below it in winter. On a clear morning, you could see the dome of the Frauenkirche against the sky, the spire of the Kreuzkirche, the roof lines of the Baroque palaces along the Brühlsche Terrasse. It was a famous view. Painters had painted it. There were postcards of it sold at the kiosk near the station entrance. I crossed that bridge twice a day for 6 years and never once stopped to look at that view in any deliberate way. That is the kind of thing you notice only later, how thoroughly ordinary a beautiful thing can become when it has always been there. The printing house where I worked was on the Ostra Alley, close enough to the old city that you could hear the Kreuzkirche bells at noon when the wind was right. We printed a daily newspaper. By 1944, it printed what it was told to print, like every paper in Germany. I was a typesetter. My job was to arrange the letters and the lines and the column rules in the trays. Someone else decided what the words said. I arranged them with care, regardless. I had been doing the same job for 8 years. I knew the feel of lead type in my hands, the way a musician knows an instrument without having to think about it, which is the only way to do careful work quickly. Dresden in that winter had a specific quality I have tried to describe many times without quite getting right. It was not peaceful, it was suspended. Everyone knew the war was going badly, not from the newspaper, which did not say so plainly, but from what you could see and calculate for yourself. The refugees coming from the east, the gaps in the shop windows, the way people spoke about the future, never beyond the next week, never with any assumption that plans made now would be honoured by the month after. And yet the bakeries opened, the trams ran. I set type each evening and went home across the bridge and argued with Heinz about typesetting errors, and I told myself that Dresden was different, that the war, which had taken everything from Hamburg, from Cologne, from a dozen other cities I could name, had for reasons I did not examine passed over Dresden and would continue to do so. Everyone in Dresden had some version of this belief. It came in different forms. Some said the city was protected by its cultural significance, the paintings, the architecture, the reputation. Some said the Allies would need Dresden intact for post-war administration. Some said nothing at all, but continued their routines with a particular quality of deliberateness, as if normalcy itself were a form of protection. We were all wrong. We were wrong in the most complete way a group of people can be wrong. I had been born in the Neustadt, in the same street where I still lived, in 1945. My father had been a press operator before me, not a typesetter, but a press operator, which was considered a different and slightly lesser trade, though we never discussed this distinction at home. He died of influenza in 1936, before the war made all other causes of death seem like private matters. My mother was still alive, 2 streets away, in the same flat where she had lived for 30 years. My wife, Gertrude, worked at the Kaufhaus on the Prager Strasse, selling fabric. She was good at it. She had an instinct for what a customer actually wanted, an ability to read what people needed without being told. We had married in 1941, which in retrospect was an unusual moment to choose for a wedding, though it did not seem unusual then. You made the decisions that were still available to make, and tried not to think too carefully about the timing. Our flat was 3 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building on the Bautzner Strasse, solid 19th century construction, with thick walls and small windows that held heat badly in winter, but gave a reassuring sense of permanence. The feeling that the building had stood through other difficulties and intended to continue. The staircase had cast iron railings. The front door was heavy oak, with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head that I had polished every Saturday morning since we moved in. I polished it on the Saturday before the bombing. My daily life in the winter of 1944-45 had the quality of a wound-down mechanism, not quite operating at full capacity, but still moving in its established patterns. I rose at 6, made coffee from ersatz that tasted of roasted grain and not much else, and walked to the Augustus Brücke. Work began at 7:30. The morning was typesetting from the previous evening's edited copy. The afternoon was page makeup and corrections. The evening edition went to press at 6, and I was usually home by 7. In the evenings, Gertrude and I listened to the radio, not for news, since the news was unreliable and increasingly strange in tone, but for music. There was still music on the German radio in 1944. Beethoven, Brahms, occasionally something lighter that I can no longer name. I remember the music more clearly than I remember most of what we said to each other in those months. That is not a criticism of our conversations. It is simply what I remember. Heinz, my colleague at the paper, was 44 years old and had been exempted from military service because of a lung condition that had left him with a persistent cough. He had worked at the paper longer than I had and knew more about it, not just the mechanics but the arrangements, the unspoken understandings about which stories could be typeset without comment and which required a particular kind of careful inattention. He was not a brave man or a cowardly one. He was practical in a situation that rewarded practicality above almost all else. We ate lunch together at the same table in the small canteen at the back of the print house every working day for 6 years. I knew almost everything about his professional opinions and almost nothing about his private life. This seemed, at the time, like a reasonable arrangement. I did not know, in that winter, that Heinz would not survive the spring. He died in March 1945 from exposure or from the lung condition, or probably from both in combination. I learned of it from another colleague weeks later. By then there was so much dying to account for that, even this felt like something to note and set beside the rest. The evening of 13 February 1945 was Shrove Tuesday. Gertrude had made a kind of pancake with what flour we had. I was at work until 6, the edition had run late, and when I crossed the bridge, the sky was clear and very cold, with stars visible over the Altstadt. One of those Dresden winter evenings, when the air has a crystalline quality and the city looks almost theatrical against the sky. I was home by 7:30. We ate the pancakes. At 10 minutes to 11, the air raid sirens began. Dresden had had alerts before none that resulted in actual bombing, and we knew the procedure. Gertrude and I took our coats. I took the document case from under the bed, identification papers, our marriage certificate, a small amount of money. Every household had its version of the document, case by 1945. We went down to the cellar. 9 others were already there, the building supervisor and his wife, 2 elderly sisters from the floor above us, a woman with a child of perhaps 6 whose husband was at the front, and 2 men I did not know well from the ground floor. We waited. The first wave arrived at 11 minutes past 11. The building supervisor announced the time in the way people do when they feel precision offers some control over events. His wife said, "That is a lucky number." She said it without irony. People reach for what they have. The bombers made a sound that was not quite a sound, a vibration that moved through the stone of the building and through the floor and through the bench beneath me and through my body. I felt it before I heard it distinctly. The first explosions began while the building supervisor's wife was still speaking. The cellar lights went out. Someone lit a candle. The child, the small boy, did not cry. He sat against his mother with his face pressed into her side and did not move. I remember thinking, he has already learned to be still. That is what stays with me from those first minutes. Not the sound, not the fear. The child who had already learned to be still. The first wave lasted approximately 50 minutes. In the silence that followed, the building supervisor went up to look and came back to report fire visible to the south over the Altstadt. The second wave arrived at 1:30 in the morning. By then the fire from the first wave had done its preparatory work. The high explosive bombs had opened the buildings, removed the roofs, exposed the interiors. The incendiaries that followed had something to work with. The fire spread in the way fire spreads when there is nothing left to contain it. This is when the firestorm began. A firestorm is not simply a large fire. It generates its own weather, a column of superheated air rising so rapidly that it draws cold air inward at ground level. The inward rush feeds the fire climbs, the draw increases. It becomes self-sustaining. It cannot be fought. It can only be left. In the cellar we felt it as a pressure change, a pulling in the ears, then a roar that was also a wind, coming from everywhere at once. The iron door of the cellar shook in its frame. Not from impact, from suction. The building supervisor said, "We have to move." He was right. In a firestorm, the greatest danger in a cellar is not fire, it is oxygen depletion. People die in sealed cellars without a flame ever reaching them. This had been known since Hamburg in 1943. We went up. Our street was intact. The Neustadt had been struck, but not uniformly, and we had not been hit directly. But the sky to the south was not sky. It was a wall of orange light, moving and alive, and the heat from it was perceptible against the face as a warmth not unpleasant, which was the wrong thing to feel. And I was aware, even then, that it was the wrong thing. We stood in the street for perhaps 3 minutes. Then someone said we needed to go north, away from the fire. Gertrude took my arm. We walked. I have been asked many times what it was like to watch Dresden burn. The question is reasonable. It is also, in a specific way, the wrong question. Because watching implies a distance that was not available. You do not watch a firestorm from outside it. You are inside it, or you are walking away from its edge. And either way you are part of the event rather than a witness to it. What I remember from that night is not primarily visual. It is a set of specific sensory facts. The smell of burning that was not wood or paper or fabric, but all of those combined into something without a name. The warmth against the face that persisted for kilometers. The ash falling like dry snow onto the shoulders of coats. The continuous voice of the fire itself, not the explosions which had diminished, but the fire which had not. What I understood that night, what took me longest to say honestly, is that a city is not its buildings.
Buried, it was simply
I had
waiting.
believed, without ever stating it, that Dresden was its buildings. The Frauenkirche, the Zwinger, the particular proportions of the Altmarkt. I believed this the way people believe things they have never needed to examine. What the fire showed me was that a city is its routines. The argument about the typesetting error, the pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, the brass lion polished on Saturday morning, the Kreuzkirche bells at noon when the wind is right. None of those burned. This sounds like a consolation, and I have sometimes offered it as one. It is not entirely a consolation. The buildings did burn, and with them the continuity that buildings carry, the layering of time that makes a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Dresden, after the bombing, was not the same city wearing different walls. It was a different place that carried the same name. But here is what I never heard anyone say in the years immediately after. The bombing did not destroy what people thought it destroyed. Everyone mourned the Frauenkirche. I mourned it too. But the Frauenkirche did not collapse on the night of the bombing. It survived the initial fires and stood for 2 days before the heat-weakened sandstone gave way on the 15th, settling into a rubble heap that would remain for 40 years. Its destruction became the symbol of Dresden's loss, the single image that stood for everything. But the people I knew who died did not die in the Frauenkirche. They died in cellars, in streets, on the riverbanks where they had run to escape the heat. They died in ways that were ordinary and physical and had nothing to do with symbols. The great symbolic loss and the human loss occupied the same event without ever being quite the same thing, and I found that most public language about Dresden moved between the two without noticing the gap. I noticed the gap because Heinz died in March, and no one built a monument to Heinz. I noticed it when I ran into one of the elderly sisters from my building, 18 months later, in the street. She was carrying a basket of turnips. She looked at me and said, "Well, we are still here." That was all. I have thought about it many times since. By sunrise on the 14th, I was on the Heide, the open heathland north of the city, with Gertrude and perhaps 200 people I did not know. We had walked for several hours. The fire was still burning behind us, its glow visible against the pale winter sky. From that distance it looked almost beautiful. That is the last thing that surprises people when I tell it. I stood in that field in the early morning of the 14th of February and thought that the fire destroying my city was beautiful. That is not the word anyone wants to hear. But I have tried, for 30 years, to be accurate rather than appropriate. And accuracy requires me to say, yes, beautiful. And that did not diminish the horror. Both things were true, and I have never found a way to explain this to anyone who was not standing in that field at that hour. I went back to Dresden. Not immediately, in the weeks after. I was in several different places, staying with relatives, working briefly at a print shop in a smaller town. The situation was chaotic in ways that are difficult to explain in retrospect, because memory has reduced it to a sequence of events that makes more sense than the events did at the time. But I went back. By the summer of 1945, I was in the Neustadt again, in a different flat on a different street. The Bautzner Strasse building had survived in structure, but not in habitability. The oak door with the brass lion was still standing. I never tried to explain that. I returned to typesetting. The paper had continued publishing. Presses survive, paper is found, people still need something to read. The physical work was the same, lead type in the hands, columns and rules. The same attention required as always. I crossed the Augustusbrücke again when the bridge was repaired, and I looked at the view, the famous view, the painter's view. The dome of the Frauenkirche was gone. The skyline was lower. But the Elbe was the same river, running the same dark green in winter, and the light on the water in the early morning was the same light. What I know is this: I set type for 40 more years. I crossed that bridge twice a day for 4 decades. I polished the brass lion on a different door, and on certain clear winter evenings, when the air had that crystalline quality, and the stars were visible over the rebuilt skyline, I would stop on the bridge and look at the city, not because I thought I owed it that attention, because I had failed to give it that attention before, and I had learned, in February 1945, that there is only one way to learn what something is worth.